Hello, I'm Tom Roche. I'm from the Business Sprinkler Alliance, and today I'm going to talk to you around the subject of fire and sustainability, just to offer some perspectives on how they come together or how one impacts the other. So firstly, the Business Sprinkler Alliance. We're an organisation that was formed in 2010. A group of 6 like-minded organisations came together to talk about the impacts of and the benefits of sprinklers to the economy. Fire has a devastating impact on economic, social, and environmental aspects, and we can see the benefits of sprinklers in combating all of those. So that runs into my theme for today, and when I'm going to give you a bit more of a perspective on environmental and sustainable issues and fire. Forgive me, I'm probably not going to get into all the weeds of all the different aspects of elements that impact that, but just to give a broad perspective on how I see this issue and where fire and fire protection fit within it. So the first place to start is really to talk about sustainability. There have been many discussions on sustainability, but I keep coming back to a slide like this that talks about 3 distinct arms: the environmental aspects, social aspects, and economic aspects. And at the heart of that is really sustainability. When we think about our built environment, we need to balance those factors to reach that sustainability. And if we were to look to the UN and think about a definition of sustainability, they would talk about meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generation to meet their own needs. And so that's the context of which I'm going to start talking about sustainability. And you will already notice that I've mentioned these 3 things before, because they're also things I look at and think fire impacts. Fire has an impact on economics, fire has an impact on the social aspects, and it also has an impact on the environment. So you can probably start to see why I'm already starting to think these 2 things come together. The other thing that's out there is one of the drivers for sustainability has been economics. I know everybody will talk about the planet, but actually it makes good economic sense. There is a good return from making things more sustainable over the long period, enabling future generations to have their benefits, and making the best use of the available materials that we have today. So that economic aspect, I know people sometimes query that about sustainability, but unless something is viable, it's not going to happen. And that's an important aspect as we think about sustainability. One of the other things that whenever I talk about sustainability, people quickly sort of jump into a couple of areas, and it's important to recognize those. One is ratings, rating schemes. So in the UK, it may be BREEAM. We went to the US, it may be looking at LEED, maybe in Australia looking at Green Star. But they're all aimed at the same thing, is looking at the performance of a building during its construction and to an extent during its operational life. We're also used to seeing ratings of buildings in terms of their energy performance and what does that mean over the long haul. Because obviously it's not just at construction, it's through the operational life that we're starting to assess, well, what's the impact of those assets in those 3 areas in terms of social, environmental, and sort of economic impacts. I can't escape but sort of talk about things that other people sort of really sort of latch into when we talk about sustainability, which is our built environment is having to change, it's having to adapt to meet these needs. One of the things people often talk about is new styles of construction. This is a picture of a building in Europe where a lot of vegetation has been added to the building to enhance its sustainability. Others talk about timber construction. No doubt others have mentioned that during this conference as we sort of gone forward through it, and the transition away from some conventional materials to going back to some older materials that we've brought forward to today, and increase of use of items like timber. Others may have mentioned to you insulation. uh, as we seek to sort of drive down the environmental impacts and conserve energy, we're seeing the increase in the use of insulation in buildings, which in itself has an impact on their performance in fire. And at the same time, we're looking more and more to ways to generate energy, moving away from the fossil fuels of the past, perhaps to looking at wind and solar panels as ways of being more sustainable in the way we generate energy to be used within the built environment. Now, all those things are really interesting, but sometimes we could be forgiven for thinking that a lot of the discussion on sustainability really centres on construction. Now, construction does represent a huge part of the carbon emissions of a building, but if you stop to think about that construction period is quite short in the relative terms of the lifespan of a building. So actually, the operational phase of a building, is really, really important. And when we think about that, we've got to think about the fact that some of the built environment is going to persist for quite a period of time. We talk about design lives. I don't think anybody anymore talks about 20 years as a design life. It's 40 years, it's 60 years, or in the case of this building, it's beyond that. We're getting towards 100 years for some buildings. And all that is periods of time when they will still continue to make a contribution to carbon emissions, and we have to think about their sustainability. At the same time, there's an increasing movement to look at how do we make some of these buildings more recyclable? We build it today, and in 40 or 60 years' time, can we reuse elements of that building to make future buildings? So they're all elements of sustainability. And I know right now some of you are probably thinking, well, when are you going to talk about fire? Well, let's think about some of the things I've said and just think about them in terms of the lifespan of a building, and then just think about the comparison between conventional construction and perhaps green construction. When we think about the event of construction, more conventional thinking is, we go through a construction phase, there's an operational phase, and then we go through demolition. And all those elements have certain level of carbon emissions, all things that we would look at to sort of capture as part of that sustainability of that particular building. And when we think about green construction, we're often thinking about, well, actually, what can we replace from or use for those buildings to sort of lower that impact? And so when often we're talking about that sustainable view, it's not hard to see how we fall into thinking that looks at, well, what's the reduction in carbon emissions we can have over the life of the building by changing some of the materials we use for its construction, and how do we lessen the impact in terms of operation? So some of those things we were talking about in terms of using more insulation, generating energy in different ways, they all have that impact of reducing those carbon emissions over time, increasing the sustainability that we see from that built asset. If we think about another event that comes along, so say there's a disturbance to a building during its lifetime, this is where I think fire fits, is the fact that if you were to see an event, you could end up with a difference, and that difference comes about because of the way in which an event impacts that built asset. So think of today, there's an event at that green built building. All of a sudden, there's damage to the building. We have to go through phases of salvage, we have to go through phases of repair, and then we get the asset back into operation. Now, it's not hard to see that if you have to repair, rebuild, or salvage part of a building and then continue to operate it, there's a good chance, unless that incident is rather small, that you're probably going to end up, increasing those carbon emissions. And that increase can be quite significant. And this is where I think we have to start thinking about fire and fire during the life of a built asset. And we have to think very carefully about it, because in 40 to 60 years of a built asset's life, fire is a likely event, or it's a likely scenario that somebody will have to consider. And there are certain things about some of the approaches we're taking to sustainability that could make the impact of that fire greater. So People then sort of start thinking, well, you've already talked about some things that probably should stop that and should reduce that. So people ask, well, what about all these green credentials that are out there? How do they increase, decrease that likelihood of that happening? Well, I have to say that most of these sustainability credentials do not deal with the aspect of fire. They're more to do with that first thing I showed you was how do we reduce the overall emissions from a building over its time. The incident or disruption from a fire doesn't appear here. Actually, their view, and most of the view of these credential agencies, is fire is dealt with through building regulations. Now, if we stop to think about building regulations, perhaps in most countries, it deals with means of escape. It deals with the fire resistance of a building. It deals with how big a space can you create and how close that building could be to its neighbours. Perhaps access for firefighters. It doesn't really sort of get at that sort of element of stopping a fire because it has a sustainability impact. And if you take that slightly further to think about other things that could impact on a building, like, for instance, an earthquake, flood, or wind, some of those things are not dealt with in building codes really to sort of minimize their impact in terms of sustainability. They're there to protect people within the building. And some of that may lead to considerable damage to a building as long as people are able to escape or able to survive the incident. It's not about the asset continuing. And that's quite an important thing to think about as you go forward and you think about the element of, well, how do fire and sustainability come together? It's also an area that's often misunderstood. Recent survey done by the BSA using, a well-known sort of research agency, YouGov, we looked at, well, how do people understand building regulations here in England? And actually what we discovered is 7 out of 10 people thought that their property would be adequately protected by meeting the regulations. That's not the intent of the regulation. So there's also a bit of a misunderstanding, and it leads to some interesting case studies to make my point. The first of which is probably not the building you're thinking I would talk about. It's actually a warehouse. This is a building completed in 2017, fabulous new 40,000 square metre distribution warehouse in the Midlands of England, 15-metre roof height. It had some great sustainability features to reduce its overall operational carbon emissions. In fact, it was given an excellent rating by one of the green credential agencies, and it's intended to have met building regulations. The question is, what happened when it met an unfortunate incident? Well, actually, it burnt completely to the ground. And actually, that happened within 6 months of this building being built. So in terms of that question about, is that resilient or is that sustainable? I think you can quite quickly see that some of those credentials don't necessarily translate into resilience to fire. And it opens a question mark about, well, what does this mean for sustainability? My next example is another fabulous building. This is a building, it's actually a lab, again, in the Midlands of the UK. It won all sorts of awards in 2017. This building actually carries the title of being a carbon neutral laboratory, and it's won outstanding ratings from credential agencies, from BREEAM, LEED. It meets building regulations, but is it resilient? So unlike last time, this building unfortunately suffered a major fire before it was completed. It was completely burnt to the ground 3 years before it reopened. Stop and think about that. Here's a building that claims to be carbon neutral now, has all sorts of credentials, but actually when it was being created, it was completely flattened. All that material had to be scraped away and replaced. Now think about that in terms of, well, what does that mean for sustainability? What does that mean for that future view? And that's really where I'm coming back to with this, to think about how does fire and sustainability fit together? And I come back to the same diagram I showed you earlier, where we have to start thinking about here's my green building. I have put into it the best endeavours in terms of sustainability, but there is a question that says, well, what happens if there's a fire? And if that fire is significant, what does that mean for my building? Does it lead, like in those two examples, to complete demolition? Does it lead to complete rebuild? And then moving back into an operational phase? And I don't think it takes a lot of thinking to sort of see that comes with quite a cost. Something that you have to think, well, how can we offset that? And I believe that's where we need to start thinking about fire, because fire during the life of a building is a very credible scenario. How big that fire is something that's actually we can sort of look at, well, what measures have we put in place to contain that? Because unfortunately, if we have a fire, it really comes down to how big that incident is. There's also the element of some of the things we do today in the name of resilience also increase the likelihood of that increased damage. Some of the materials that are being selected to create certain buildings have a propensity for more damage. It's not about not liking timber. It's just the fact that timber does burn. Some of the insulations that are chosen also increase that likelihood of damage. And by their very nature, some of the buildings we're building, in terms of large open structures, also have the same propensity for large amounts of damage. And that's really the perspective that I want to leave with you, is to think about, well, fire is a credible scenario that we need to put back into our thinking on sustainability. And I come back to where I started on this journey to talk about merging our perspectives. To preserve sustainability, we have to think about the same three things, but from a fire perspective, we have to think about them as potential impacts on sustainability. We can drive real sort of consequences for sustainability if we don't protect or adequately protect against the potential for a fire. So my perspective on this is fire is a real consideration in the life scale of a building, or the lifespan of a building, that has material impacts on sustainability if we're not also looking at methods to minimize that impact, like from using active fire protection like sprinklers. Then we're running the risk that we're going to lose some of the credits that we've gained from using that sustainability. And that becomes very important as we strive to move the needle on sustainability, to really think, is this having an impact on the potential for fire? Have we done enough to minimize those impacts? It's not about whether regulations is good enough. It's more, what are we thinking to sort of meet that target on sustainability? Can we sort of do more? There is a balance there that says you're increasing the carbon emissions by putting additional materials into a building to, say, protect against the impact of fire. But you're also offsetting that should that occur. And you've got to think about that balance over the life of a structure and its usability. So a bit of a sort of thought provoker. Hopefully it's given you food for thought, particularly some of those small graphics and those case studies. But it's one to think about, that I do believe fire has a real part to play in sustainability as long as we merge those perspectives, because the same things we value to sort of gain sustainability are the impacts of fire. And we need to bring those two things together to sort of look at how do we protect against them. So once again, I've been Tom Roche from the Business Sprinkler Alliance. Hopefully you've enjoyed this session. Thank you very much for your time.
Hi, Tom. It's great to have the Business Sprinkler Alliance back at Fire by Alive, and thank you for presenting your session on sustainability in the built environment when it comes to fire safety. I just had a couple of questions to go through, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely, no problem.
So this is the second time that the BSA is presented at Fire by Alive. Is there a specific reason you wanted to speak here today?
I think as the Business Sprinkler Alliance, we believe a lot in education and an open discussion about fire safety. So the more opportunities we have to speak and share our views, the more opportunity we have to interact with people to sort of test those views, share those views, and gain some feedback on those views. and Fire by Live offers us a great opportunity to do that.
It's great to have you back here. Thank you. So just going into your presentation a little bit, sustainability is such a huge topic at the moment in the industry, not just in the passive side, but also in the active side of the market. Is there a particular reason that you focus on the economic benefits as opposed to the environmental? And is this something that the BSA is looking to raise awareness on this year?
I think if we take a step back and look at the presentation, it's all those dimensions. There's an economic, social, and environmental impact that comes from fire. And whenever we're talking about sustainability, my fear is we're always talking about carbon emissions and sort of energy usage, but we forget that bad things happen. And fire in the built environment is one of those things that can have a dramatic impact on the built environment. And so therefore we have to nudge the wheel slightly to get people to think about that and say, well, if we're valuing that sustainability so much, how do we protect it? And that means thinking about, well, what are some of those systems that can be put in place to sort of minimize the impact of fire, whether it's that makes good economic sense, whether that makes good environmental sense, or that makes good economics and environment and social sense for UK PLC.
Definitely attack from all angles.
Yeah.
So just going back to what you just mentioned there. So are there any specific materials or solutions that are both sustainable and more fire protective that can benefit the longevity of a building?
I think that's the challenge here. There's certain things that are happening in the built environment that we are adding materials or different materials to the building, and they each have different consequences. I wish there was a wonder material that did everything. And I think this is what I'm trying to get at when I was sort of saying that sustainability and sort of like economics come together, because there's a point at which things are more viable than others. As we seek to use more timber products or we seek to use more insulation, that has a direct impact on fire. We have to think that through and start thinking, well, do we need to put in place additional protection because of that? So I'd love there was a wonder product, but I think it's more about thinking through some of the decisions we're making and what does that mean for fire. It may have a good impact for sustainability or carbon emissions, but what does that mean for the fire safety of a building? And are we doing enough to offset some of those increases in sort of potential damage so that we can reap the rewards of the sustainability credit was so hard, that's so hard won.
But it's about finding that balance in that pre-construction risk assessment. And then you also mentioned some of the approaches to fire safety in a building's life cycle that could make the impact of a fire even greater. Could you just clarify one example of what you mean by this?
Yeah, and that's why I've got to be careful. It's like the example I showed for the laboratory. It was a timber frame building, timber clad building. That's a lab. And it means it was very vulnerable to a fire during its construction phase. And when it was finally finished, unless it had some other means of protection, I think the outcome was the outcome we saw. And that's the challenge that I see going forward. It's not that some materials are bad, it's more the consequence of fire could be greater because they have a greater propensity for fire spread. Therefore, we need to think differently about what do we need to do about that in a building context.
And you also mentioned how building regulations or codes don't necessarily take into consideration sustainability. Do you think this is something that will change in the near future?
I think that's the other part of this, is joining things up. In one direction, regulations are driving certain behaviours in terms of, insulation properties on buildings. They're driving the need to use self-generation, so photovoltaics and other things. The joined up thinking I don't see in regulations is what's the impact of that when it comes to things like fire safety. And I think that's where we have to start thinking more clearly about what does this mean, and not wait for the bad thing to happen to suddenly go, ooh, we need to go back and rethink this. We have to get ahead of that and start thinking about, well, if we're going to strap all these things to a building, what's the true impact of that? Is there something smart we can do in terms of what we put on the outside of a building, or do we need to use more fire sprinklers inside certain types of building because that's going to give us the best outcome long term?
Definitely. And like you said, it's about the understanding on not just the regulatory body's point of view, but also the building owners, and understanding fully what the regulations mean and how it impacts the building and the building's purpose.
Yeah, I think if you look at it, sorry, Rebecca, it's just I think what we're on that sort of cusp of. There's a lot of innovation going on, and the challenge with innovation is how do we understand the impact of that innovation going forwards, and there's always a bit of catch up. The thing I'm sort of advocating is we need to sort of start thinking early about some of those impacts from fire for some of those innovations, and start saying, is there smart stuff we can do now to sort of avoid, future sort of like larger impacts, where we have to go and remediate buildings, or we have to sort of start adding things back into buildings that we probably should have put in there in the first place. And that's an area I think regulations, codes, and standards are always, they believe they sort of capture innovation, but truly, there's always a gap.
And lastly, if anybody wants to find out more about the BSA, for example, or understand more about this side of sustainability, are there any live shows that you guys will be attending at any point soon?
Yeah, they can. The BSA will be at FireX later this year. We'll also be part of the Fire Conference that's in the UK, or they can reach out. I'm quite easy to find on LinkedIn. So is the BSA. If they have questions or they would like to sort of engage more, quite happy to do that.
Fantastic. Well, we certainly look forward to seeing you at those shows too. Well, thank you for taking the time to catch up again, and enjoy the rest of the show. If anybody else has any further questions about the BSA or Tom's presentation, please reach out directly to him on the platform and you guys can connect. Thank you.